Welcome to SeizeYourBusiness.com. My name is Kevin O'Flaherty from O'Flaherty Law, and I'm joined by my co-host Jim Waszak from Success Enhancement.
Hello, everybody.
And we have today two guests. We've got Ben Pohl and Ray Palys from Strata Management Consulting. And our topic today, Jim, why don't you rattle off the topic you came up with? It.
Create value by removing the owner, which is a little intriguing because a lot of smaller businesses, the owner is the value. But by being continually involved and not creating the right processes and the right team, you really reduce your value. And our guests are going to speak to that today.
Yeah, so why don't you guys tell us about yourselves and Strata and what your experience is.
Terrific. Strata was founded by me in San Diego, California, 22 years ago. And we focus on the small to mid-sized business market, typically in the 5 million to 100 million in revenue range. One of the areas we're focusing on in the Chicago area is succession planning, which our discussion falls under that broad umbrella of succession planning. And the idea is to, as Jim mentioned, to create value or increase the value of an organization without or with less direction, oversight, strategy, and execution by a founder. That's where the real value and attractiveness in the business comes in. Now, of course, you have to have a certain amount of people. If you have 3 people in your organization, it's difficult to do that. But once you start getting up in the $1.5 million, $2 million a year in revenue, you usually have some pretty key people. And you can begin that process of structuring your organization to be less dependent.
So where would you, I mean, we've seen this a lot where, Mr. Entrepreneur starts a business and he grows it to a certain level, yet he's still got his hand in every decision. It's sometimes hard for them to let go. How does an owner get to the mindset that he even wants to do this?
If there's pain. I think if there's no pain in an organization, then an organization usually doesn't change. But let's go under the presumption that an owner would like to work less, would like to have more depth in his or her organization. And if that's the case, then the starting point becomes strategic planning. Most smaller companies, and I'll say companies under 25 million a year in revenue, do not consistently employ a strategic planning process. Most of them will have something they call strategic planning, but it's really in their minds. They sit down maybe once a quarter and they come up with the next quarter's goals or maybe the next year's goals. But again, it's driven by themselves. So the starting point is you're going through a formalized strategic planning process of which you're including your key people. Maybe you've got 6 or 8 people in an organization that you consider to be key people, and they become part of that process. So they're talking about the current situation. They're talking about the future. They're doing what we call a SWOT analysis, strengths, weakness, opportunities, threats. And from that, you are developing a very specific roadmap or blueprint, if you will, of your short-term being your 1-year goals and then your 3 to 5-year goals. And so that begins the process of including your team in that process of planning.
We find a lot of times our listeners like to hear case studies or stories. Can you give an example of a company that kind of went through this process and what it looked like prior and what it looked like
absolutely.
after?
I can give a number of them, but we'll start with one. A manufacturing company. It was a young owner in his early 30s, had 50 employees, did about, I think around 12 million a year in revenue, and he brought us in because he was going to have a nervous breakdown. He didn't have a college degree. Very smart man, knew the process of manufacturing, came up with a very innovative way to produce what he produced. But he didn't understand how do you structure an organization? How do you create divisions? How do you create departments? How do you delegate? And so he was going to have a nervous breakdown, as would any 4 of us if we had 50 people reporting to us and we had to make those decisions. So fellow's name is Bruce. We went in, we created an organizational structure, started coaching and creating a leadership team. And with Bruce, I said, Bruce, I said, we've got to mentor your new department heads on how you make decisions. So for about 2 or 3 years, every major decision that came up, he would sit down one-on-one with that individual, and he would tell them the process of how he made decisions. So we've all heard the adage, feed someone fish, you feed them for a day. Teach them to fish, and you feed them for life. So it took about 2 or 3 years for the team to coalesce. let's fast forward 15 years. The company does about $75 million a year in revenue. There's 170 employees. Bruce comes in about 2 hours a day. He operates as a true CEO. There's a president now that runs the day-to-day operation. So there's an example of when you start running your business the way we're talking about in terms of outside of the owner, this is where the growth becomes explosive. And I can give you, numerous stories in different industries all around that, but that's the process.
I have to chuckle because you use that analogy about the fish. My wife likes to do that to me. She's going to teach me how to fish, and I tell her, no, I don't want to know how to fish. Just give me the fish. Just give me the fish. It doesn't work too well.
Yeah. Well, it's quicker, and that's a common thought. It's easier to feed someone a meal than it is to teach them to fish. And this is where, Jim, you talked about what are some of the obstacles or some of the reasons why owners don't want to undertake this. The first one is they just don't know. We all don't know what we don't know. You've all heard that adage. Second is the what kind of a process do you employ or do you put in to have that happen, which is a block. And then third, it's just the time commitment. To do that. But if somebody has, again, a 3 to 5 year vision that looks at their organization, looks at their business and says, I want to be here less, or I want to be able to grow this faster than I can on my own. Because if you think about it, you're leveraging. Let's say you have 5 or 6 key people that are part of this management team that are involved in developing and executing strategy. You now have 5 more people that can possibly grow that business. And this is where the growth begins to accelerate.
Right.
There's only so much that an individual can do. And we've all heard of the Peter Principle, which is we all reach our level of incompetence. Sounds harsh, but that's the reality. And this happens a lot to business owners who reach that ceiling of incompetence. And that's when I mentioned earlier the pain. If there's no pain, people generally don't change. But when there's pain, whether it's time, a lack of time, and one wants to spend more time with their family, that becomes a pain point. Or the profitability of the organization is not what it should be, that becomes a pain point. So these are all pain points that determine whether or at what extent or what rate of change people are going to change.
Well, and you know what? Maybe you can comment to this, or maybe you, or even Kevin, maybe has a story. But that what I see happen a few times is usually a man, entrepreneur, founder. He's working hard to build a business. He dies. Now his widow is stuck. She's either got to sell the business at some loss, tries to run it, runs it into the ground. Not that, it couldn't be other, but it seems to me that if people had sort of like a process like you described, that would be much less of an issue.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. And bankers should be looking at this too, because they're loaning. They're looking at the health of an organization and ultimately the sustainability. The old proverbial bus. We're all a bus, away from a bus hit away from not being here, tomorrow.
Yep.
So you look at the responsibility that an owner has, and it's not just to his family, but it's to all the stakeholders in an organization. And when you think about all the people that are involved, take a company with 50 employees, and let's say the owner has a wife and 2 kids, presuming it's a male owner. So you look at, there's 4 people that are really involved or depend on the business. Sure, let's extend that. You've got 50 employees. Let's look at the spouses of those employees and the kids. You probably have 200 people that are dependent on that organization. Now let's look at the customers. Let's look at the suppliers. Let's look at the community if they're involved. So that responsibility transcends the money that an individual takes on. And it's really important to look at the sustainability. And again, things are not sustainable when they're dependent on one individual. So again, the reason.
So let me ask you, Ben. So you're out there doing business development for this, talking to owners about this. What kinds of things do you find gets their attention the most, resonates the most? Where this becomes exciting to them.
Well, the older owners that I meet, I ask them, where do you want to be in 10 years? And they look at me with the blank face, blank eyes, and they say, I really have no idea. So a lot of owners don't even think about, what am I going to do in 10 years? There was a survey, PricewaterhouseCoopers, that I always think about, and they split the owners they surveyed in 4 groups. So there's 25% each. So 25% said, when it's time to retire, we're just gonna close shop, close door, business done. 25% then said, I really have no idea. So they haven't even considered what's going on. Then there's 25% that say, well, we're gonna give it to our children, and that's pretty much it. You know, when time comes, we'll just hand over to our kids, wham bam, thanks. And then there's the 25% that actually are gonna sell it. So the interesting part about that 25% is 70% of those are not gonna sell. So, or they're not even gonna get close to what they expect. So, you know, the owners, until they really understand the issue at hand, they're really hesitant. You know, consultant. I know everything. I have a big ego. I built this. It's my way. I've always done it this way. And so yeah, so just showing the owners what, you know, showing them to think about, you know, the future and what they want to do.
You overcome when you're trying to put a process like this in place. There's a lot of anytime you try to change a company's culture, you need to get buy-in from all of the stakeholders. And I tried to do this a couple years ago, and I've found some success somewhere in between the perfect ivory tower systems I wanted to create and the day-to-day chaos that was going on when I started. So, but it was very difficult to get buy-in from everybody, and a lot of times it seemed like we were having meetings about meetings. And eventually, I had to change some of my staff over to make it work. And now we do have a good delegation and good workflow, but it's not as systematized as I initially envisioned. How do you basically get through that cultural shift without firing everybody on staff and bringing people on board?
Sure. Yeah, you're referring to change management, Kevin. As humans, we're all resistant to change. We drive the same way to work. We shave. We're males from the same side every day. We often eat the same breakfast. We're creatures of habit. So anytime you change an organization, you're disrupting the flow, you're disrupting the individual. So the very first point is always have people agree on the destination, on the point. So for example, Kevin, you talked about your firm. What you want to do is make sure that everyone's on the same page with our destination. Much like the train that's parked out front of the office, it's going from point A to point B. It knows its destination, as does the conductor, the engineer, and all the people who are boarding that train. So you don't see people mingling in front of the train saying, where are we going? I'm not sure I want to get on this train, because they all know where it's going. So that's the very, very first point. And you want to get that buy-in of where an organization's going. What I found, and I've advised over 200 companies in my career as a consultant, what I found is that when you can clearly articulate the direction of the company, it's satisfying and comforting to people, because that's one of the top reasons of why people leave or choose to stay with a company is the confidence they have in the direction of that company. So if point number one is to create a common goal of that destination, then from there, you look at it as like concentric circles. You're just expanding out that circle of participation and buy-in. But to your point, Kevin, you have to get buy-in. Otherwise, you cannot change. But people need to know, there's the acronym WIFM. What's in it for me is what WIFM stands for. And you want to be able to explain, why are we going through this organizational culture change? Why are we changing the way we do what we do? And incidentally, it takes about 2 years for culture really to set in. It's not a switch. It's not a computer software program that you can install on Friday and on Monday you come in and it's a whole new business. It just takes time. You know, the culture is the values of an organization. It's the behaviors of an organization. It's the sum of its parts. And so it takes time. And you have to reinforce it, and it just doesn't happen overnight. But the process is very easy.
I'll respond to your question, Kevin, and I have an interesting one for you guys. But I've been fortunate in my management career. I've built some terrific teams. And I think the most important thing, in addition to everything that was just said, you got to prune, you got to weed out. I mean, I had, I think, a staff of 5 or 6 people, and I probably fired the most people in the company because I just was determined to get people that fit, you know, what I was looking for and would understand my culture. So I think you do have to do that. But, you know, let me ask you this question. So I know of 2 businesses. One is in the used motorcycle and motorsports business. Another is in used packaging equipment. And it seems to me that the whole business is the owner, because it's based on his ability to look at something and just call it right. You know, that bike is worth $1,000, I could sell it for $3. He just knows that. How would you take a business like that and apply, you know, your theory to it, or can you?
Yeah. Well, first of all, don't get pigeonholed into that theory. Steve Jobs may have said that. Bill Gates may have said that at one point. And what are the organizations today? Microsoft is 40,000 people. Apple, I don't even know what the numbers are, but these are very large companies. Every business started with an idea. Started around either a dining room table, maybe a lunchroom table. People decided to break off from a company they work with. So every big organization was once small. Every large organization once had 1 or 2 founders. And so if we were fearful that we could not transfer that knowledge or build an organization outside of the owner, then the world, we'd be back about 150 years. We would have all mom and pop companies with 1 or 2 employees, and that would be the world. But we know that that's not the world today. So right there, we know that there must be a method to be able to get around this. So that leads into, how do you do it? And it's what we've talked about. Again, it's that mindset. It's creating that vision of 3, 5, 10 years out. And then how do you build that team? And I want to add another point, Jim. We talked about, you mentioned about, the purging, of people. Well, let's go back to the hiring. The beginning point. Sure. Let's make sure that we're putting in a round peg into a round hole. So one instrument or tool that we use extensively, and we've got clients that use it for pre-hires, are behavioral assessments. And I prefer DISC over Myers-Briggs. There's a number of them out there. Yep. But it talks about why people do what they do, and then the values portion of how we do what we do. Very, very important. You can learn in a matter of minutes what it could take you years to figure out in terms of putting in the right people into the right place. And then also, now we talk about the organization. How well defined is the mission, the vision, the values of the organization? Because that is part of the strategic planning process. That is part of identifying who a company is and why they exist, for whom they exist. So many companies, again, we're talking the smaller companies, do not have a clear mission. They do not have a clear vision statement. They probably have words that they describe as values, but they really haven't talked about how it is in their organization, how it plays out. Right. So as you can see, there's a series of steps. There's processes, there's systems, there's ways that you build an organization to become the Microsoft or the Apples of the world. That's my analogy.
Cool. And DISC is a tool I'm familiar with. In fact, a friend of mine does it, and he asked me to create a contest for him. He sends out this crazy scenario I created, and everybody's got to identify who are the D's, the I's, the S's, and the C's. So, it can be a lot of fun. Yeah, so it's good. It's a good tool.
Yeah, and then you use them for pre-hire. They're great instruments to build team effectiveness, because I call it, in an organization, you have communication barriers. And I call them, they're the Great Wall of China, the barrier to communication. And give an example. Most business owners who are using DISC are what we call high D, very high, very driven people. They make decisions very, very rapidly. And let's say they have an engineer that works for the organization, or an accountant. They tend to be introverted. They tend to be very technical, very analytical, requiring a lot of information. So let's say, Jim, you're the owner of the company, you're the high D, and I'm the accountant or the engineer. And I come into your office and I say, Jim, gosh, I've got this idea. It's going to take me a while to lay it all out, but I really think this is a great idea. And so you're listening for about 30 seconds. You make decisions very, very rapidly. So you're getting a little impatient because I'm doing about a 45-minute presentation here. And so finally, after 15 minutes, you go, Ray, I think that's a great idea. We just have to schedule another time. I don't have time for this today. So, okay, I walk out of the office and I say, I don't think Jim likes me.
Mm-hmm.
I got this great idea, and Jim just kind of shot me down. Well, Jim didn't shoot me down. I interpret things differently than Jim, and Jim interprets things differently. So let's say I went through a DISC process, and we went through a workshop where we taught everybody how do you interpret the different behaviors. And I know that Jim makes decisions really quickly. So the next time I meet with Jim, I'm prepared. Jim, I got this great idea. Here, there's 4 points. I just want to, just give you a little soundbite over here, and then let's schedule a time where we can get into the meat of it. Jim goes, great, Ray, I love the idea. Let's schedule it for Friday at 2 o'clock. We're going to sit down and go over this. And I walk out and I go, Jim really likes me.
Yeah.
This is great. But this is this barrier to communication, and it really is as simple as understanding what drives us. Why we do what we do and how we do what we do. Not magic, but darn close to it.
Right. Yeah, and I've been kind of on both sides of that, but the one in particular is come up with an idea. I tend to be really high I with a fair amount of D, very little S and C. And I come to me, hey, we should do this, and they'll say, well, what about that? I don't know. I'm just giving you the big picture. You figure out the details. So I hear you.
So one of the things that I've struggled with in trying to implement my systems is that whether it's a practice management system or a calendaring system, whenever I try to bring a system into play, so we'll just say, here's our system of how we're going to do meetings. If you have 1 or 2 people that aren't following the system and buying into it and using it right, then the whole thing kind of collapses in on the weight of itself because the other people in the organization can't trust the veracity of what's input into the system because not everyone's using it right. How do you go about it? A business owner says, I want to institute this system, whether it's an actual computer system or something, much more esoteric into my company. How do you get the employees to actually start using it, and other than just the passage of time and the business owner being ahead?
Yeah, and again, this takes a little bit more time, but I always recommend and encourage business owners to have people become involved in the process. So you bring up a good point of let's say it's a system integration, an enterprise systems going into a company. That's going to affect every facet of the organization. It's accounting, it's sales, it's calls coming in. Everyone's affected, including customers and suppliers. So what I recommend, this is change management, I recommend that the organizations put together little teams of people where you're almost doing an impact analysis, but you're getting them part of the process. When people take ownership and buy into a process, I should say when people buy into a process, they take ownership. Much like we talked about changing the culture of an organization. Sure, an owner could just say, hey, this is what we're going to do, this is how we do it. Yeah, some people will follow it. Some people may not follow it 100% because it's the boss's idea. But when you sit down in a room, and it may take if it's a small issue, maybe it's an hour discussion. But when people are part of a process, they take ownership. So I always recommend, take that time, and you're doing a couple things. One is you're getting people to buy into the process. They're providing their input, but you're also creating now a system and a process of which decisions can be made without just the owner. So the dividends pay multiple dividends down the road.
That's an excellent point. I would say there's potentially one exception to that, though, and let me tell you a story. This guy that I used to know, haven't seen him in a long time, but he used to be in the jet engine parts business, and this guy had like a genius ability to put deals together. Ask him what he did yesterday, couldn't do it. Ask him to follow any kind of procedure, couldn't do it. But a highly valued asset. They actually hired him an assistant to follow him around and capture all these details. So I think, in most cases, if you get people to buy in, it's going to work. But if you do have unique talents, you may have to come up with unique solutions to take advantage of those talents.
Sure.
That's really kind of what's happened in every single system I've tried to institute. There's, like I was talking about earlier, there's the ivory tower way that, in my brain, when I write it down on paper, I'd like the system to work. and then there's the way it actually works. And when things are, as long as the business is functioning, you don't ride people too hard about the logistics of it. But if I had a team of robots, it would be great to say, okay, here's the way I would like everything to function. Everybody do this to the T now. But you find somewhere in between the reality or the chaos before the system and what you would ideally like the system to be is the way it works on a practical level, and you tweak it, and sometimes you throw it out if people can't follow it. Right. So, anything else you guys would like to share today?
Yeah. Well, I think just on that point there, it's the participative approach. Team. The acronym for team is together. Each accomplishes more, and it's hard. It's hard for a founder of a business after 10, 20, 30 years when they've just done it their own way to now say, gosh, I do want to create something beyond me. I want to create something sustainable. We know that family businesses, only roughly 25 to 30% make it to the second generation, 12 make it to the third, and only 4% make it to the fourth generation. So it becomes increasingly more difficult to pass on businesses for the longevity, the sustainability. But these processes work. I'll give you another great story of a client. They made the most money out of the work that we did. It was a construction company doing about $10 million in revenue, had about 100 employees, and the owner brought us in to put in systems, processes, controls, so he could. And he used this analogy. He goes, Ray, picture a big tree. He goes, my arms only are going around half of the tree. He said, the dark side, the back side of the tree, I don't know what's going on over there. He goes, I just need to get my arms around that. Help me do that. So part of the process was putting in managerial accounting controls. Part of it was further developing the organizational structure and his team of people. And this goes back, we go back 16 years on this. Fast forward about 3 years into the process, the owner was comfortable in growing the business, grew it to $80 million in revenue, and sold it to a public company for $50 million at the 9-year mark. Wow. So when we talk about starting this process years in advance, this is why you do it. A lot of owners who think they're going to sell their business or plan to sell it think, okay, I'll just, in 6 months' time, I can just turn the business around. But there's so many facets involved in polishing up and creating a sustainable company that takes years, usually 2 to 3 years. Then you want to have a good 5-year track record to grow the business and then demonstrate to a potential buyer, here's how a business operates.
And I'll support that by saying I know a number of people who are in the private equity space, and when they buy businesses, one of the things they almost always want is management in place. They want to be able to just, let it kind of run the way it's been running with very little involvement from them. Yeah. So that's another big reason.
I'll even add to that. I had the privilege of meeting someone that manages 2 of the Pritzker family's private equity, and the number one criteria they look for in a business, once they zero in on the industry, is the management team. They're buying the management team. Again, they're not buying an individual, they're not buying a product, they're not buying a service, they're buying that management team and the ability of that team to continue to run that business without the founding owner of the business. So you can't underestimate or overestimate just how important building a team is. And hence that leads back to the opening statement of you create value when you can begin to structure and organize your company so that it's not dependent on the owner.
So if people want to reach out to you, how can they reach you guys?
Oh, they can reach out to us on our website at corestrata.com, corestrata.com. Or they can call me directly at 708-646-7531. Glad to share ideas and exchange thoughts on any questions and processes they'd like to know.
Okay, Jim, how can people reach you?
Best way, just call me, 630-272-3895. Be happy to talk to you.
And you can reach me at 630-324-6666. And you can check out more podcast, video blog episodes at seizeyourbusiness.com. Thanks so much, guys.